Alara stood motionless at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers clasped so tightly that the delicate stitching of her gown pressed into her palms. The laughter of lords and ladies swirled around her like perfume, but she remained untouched, invisible. Her husband, the Duke of Ashford, stood mere feet away, his broad shoulders turned toward her as if she were a stranger. He spoke in low tones to Lady Beatrice, his voice carrying that rare warmth Alara had never once received. The whispers behind painted fans grew louder. He married her for the land, of course. No love there. Look at him, he can't even bear to stand beside her. She heard every word, and not one of them was a lie. 6 months earlier, Alara Vance had stood in a quiet chapel wearing ivory silk, her heart trembling not with bridal nerves but with secret, fragile hope. Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ashford, had spoken his vows in a voice like winter, controlled, distant, final. There was no tenderness in his gray eyes, only the cool formality of a man fulfilling a duty. Alara's family had been on the brink of financial collapse, their ancestral home a whisper away from creditors. An alliance with the powerful Duke saved them, and in return her father's political influence sealed a critical vote in the House of Lords. Alara had agreed to the match for her family's sake, but she had also carried a hidden, foolish hope. She had loved Alexander from afar for 2 years, ever since she had seen him at a country fair, standing in the rain to help a child find her lost dog. He had smiled then, a fleeting, unguarded smile, and Alara had never been the same. In the weeks after their wedding, Alara tried everything she knew to reach him. She arranged his favorite flowers in the morning room. She asked gentle questions about his day. She lingered at the dinner table long after the plates were cleared, hoping he might stay and speak with her. But Alexander always retreated to his study, the heavy oak door closing with a sound that echoed through the silent halls. His politeness was flawless, his distance absolute. He never raised his voice, never spoke a cruel word, yet his coldness settled over Thornwood Hall like a permanent frost. The staff noticed. The housekeeper, Mrs. Henshaw, began leaving extra candles in the Duchess's sitting room, as if acknowledging the long, lonely nights. Alexander's younger sister, Lady Margaret, was the only soul who offered genuine warmth. She would find Alara in the garden, take her arm, and speak of trivial, cheerful things. But even Margaret's kindness could not mask the truth. Alara was a wife in name only, living in a house that was not a home. What Alara did not know, what no one knew, was that Alexander Blackwood was living in a prison of his own making. 3 weeks before the wedding, a letter had arrived at Thornwood Hall, written in a jagged hand. Lord Harrow, a man whose brother had been ruined in a business venture Alexander had exposed as fraudulent, vowed vengeance. "You will pay," the letter read, "and I will take from you whatever you hold dear. Love someone, your grace, and watch me destroy them." Alexander had immediately increased security, but the threat gnawed at him. He had already begun to feel something for the gentle-eyed woman he was to marry, having observed her from a distance during the negotiations. And so, the night before their wedding, he had made a devastating decision. He would keep her safe by keeping her at arm's length. He would play the cold, indifferent husband so convincingly that no enemy would ever believe she mattered. It was an act of protection, but it felt like self-destruction. The first weeks of marriage were torture. Alara's quiet efforts to please him, the hopeful light in her eyes, the way she arranged his study flowers, he noticed every gesture, and every one of them splintered his heart a little more. He wanted to cross the room and take her hands, to tell her she was the first warmth he had felt in years. But the memory of that letter, the certainty that Lord Harrow had eyes inside his household, froze him in place, so he became a statue. A statue that watched his wife slowly wilt and could do nothing to stop it. One afternoon, 6 months into their marriage, Alara found a stack of old letters in a forgotten drawer of the library desk. They were tied with a faded blue ribbon, the paper worn soft from handling. Curious, she unfolded one and read the elegant anonymous handwriting. "You do not know me, but I saw you once when the world seemed dark. You were kind when you thought no one was watching. That kindness saved me. Please remember, even when you feel alone, someone believes in you." Alara's breath caught. She recognized her own words, written 2 years ago, after she had learned of his broken engagement to a woman who had eloped with a wealthier lord. She had penned half a dozen letters, never intending him to know her identity, simply wanting to offer comfort to a man she admired from the shadows. And here they were, kept carefully, the ribbon tied with a tenderness that made her throat ache. He had treasured them. He had read them enough to wear the folds thin. Why then did he treat her with such distance? The question burned, but she replaced the letters exactly as she had found them, a small, painful seed of confusion planted in her heart. The first sharp turn came at the Ashford annual ball. Ilara stood alone while the ton watched and whispered. Alexander spent the evening attending to every guest except his wife. Lady Beatrice, a stunning widow with honey-colored hair, leaned close to him, laughing at his rare remarks. Ilara's cheeks flushed, not with jealousy, but with a profound, sinking loneliness. It was then that a familiar voice spoke her name. Ilara, little Ilara Vance. Surely it cannot be you, all grown up and lost in a crowd. She turned to find Lord Cedric Ashford, a distant cousin of Alexander's, smiling down at her. He had been a childhood friend, the boy who had once pulled her out of a brook and carried her home with a sprained ankle. He had spent the last 5 years on the continent and had returned only the previous week. His presence was like a door opening into a sunlit past. He took her hand, kissed it lightly, and drew her into a waltz right there in the middle of the ballroom, ignoring the rigid protocols. Ilara laughed for the first time in months, a surprised, genuine sound. Across the room, Alexander's head turned. His gray eyes tracked the couple, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. He saw his wife smile, the natural grace of her movements, the way Cedric's hand rested at her waist with casual familiarity. Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in his chest. Jealousy, raw and unwelcome, surged before he could suppress it. He forced himself to look away, but the damage was done. For the first time, the cold mask he wore felt like a cage he could not escape. After that night, Cedric began to call at Thornwood Hall with cheerful frequency. He brought books, shared stories of his travels, and made Ilara feel, for a few brief hours, like a person of worth. She knew the impropriety, but loneliness was a desperate counselor. She never crossed any line, never entertained a single improper thought, but his friendship became a lifeline. Alexander noticed every visit. He noticed the way Ilara's voice lightened when she spoke Cedric's name. And though he said nothing, a storm was gathering behind his silence. One evening, Ilara entered the drawing room to find Alexander standing by the window, his back rigid. Without turning, he spoke. "You seem to enjoy my cousin's company, madam." The words were flat, but they carried a sharp edge. Ilara paused, her heart skipping. He is an old friend. His visits break the quiet. Indeed. Alexander turned then, and for the first time she saw something other than ice in his expression, something wounded and tightly leashed. Be cautious, Duchess. The world is not kind to those who invite speculation. The mild warning stung more than any accusation could. She lifted her chin. "I have done nothing improper, Your Grace, but perhaps if my husband's company were less rare, I would not need to seek conversation elsewhere." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander's eyes flickered, and for a moment Ilara thought she saw a crack in the stone, but he only inclined his head and left the room. She stood alone, her heart hammering, a strange mix of shame and defiance surging through her veins. That night Ilara made a quiet decision. She would no longer beg for scraps of affection. She would no longer arrange flowers or wait at empty tables. She would become invisible in a different way, by choosing her own path, independent of his regard. The next morning she asked Mrs. Henshaw for a list of the estate's tenant families and a ledger of local charities. She began visiting the sick, reading to children in the village school, and overseeing repairs on neglected cottages. She threw herself into the work with quiet determination, and the hollow ache in her chest eased just a little. Alexander watched this transformation with growing unease. He saw her leave the house early in a plain wool dress, her hair simply pinned, a basket of goods on her arm. She no longer looked for him. She no longer hovered in doorways, waiting for a glance. She was pulling away, and the space she left behind was colder than any winter he had ever known. He found himself lingering near windows to catch a glimpse of her return. He noticed the smudge of flour on her sleeve, the stray curl that escaped her pins, the new calm in her eyes. She was becoming whole without him. The fear that realization stirred was so acute that he could scarcely breathe. The next emotional blow came during a small dinner party at Thornwood Hall. Lady Beatrice, ever present, made a pointed remark about the Duchess's rustic pursuits, suggesting they were beneath her station. Cedric, who was seated beside Alara, immediately came to her defense. On the contrary, my lady, such compassion is the mark of true nobility. The Duchess does more good in a single morning than most of us accomplish in a lifetime. His words were warm and sincere, and when he smiled at Alara, a hush fell over the table. Alexander's knuckles whitened around his wine glass. He saw, with brutal clarity, that another man was publicly offering the admiration he had withheld. And what was worse, Alara accepted it with quiet gratitude, her head high. After the guests departed, Alexander followed Alara to the library. She was standing near the very desk where the old letters were hidden, her expression distant. He stopped a few paces away, struggling for words. "You must know," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "that Ashford is not your keeper, but he is also not your husband in any true sense." Alara turned slowly, her face pale but composed. "I am aware, Your Grace. You have made that abundantly clear from our wedding night." The quiet resignation in her voice cut deeper than any anger. Alexander took a step forward, his carefully constructed walls trembling. Alara, her name, spoken without title, hung between them like a fragile offering. But before he could say more, a servant entered with an urgent message, and the moment shattered. Alara excused herself, and Alexander was left staring at the empty doorway, the ghost of her presence tormenting him. Days passed in agonizing quiet. Alara's charities expanded, and she spent more time at the village. She began writing letters to her mother about an extended visit home, the idea taking root in her heart like a refuge. She told no one at Thornwood Hall, but the servants began to notice a small trunk in her sitting room, slowly filling with personal belongings. The housekeeper informed the Duke. That night, Alexander found himself standing in his wife's sitting room, staring at the trunk. The sight unraveled something inside him. She was leaving. Not dramatically, not in anger, but quietly, the way she did everything. And he realized with a clarity that stole his breath that he could not let her go. The following afternoon, an unexpected event forced everything into the open. Alara had taken a carriage to the village to visit a sick tenant. She had insisted on going alone, leaving even her maid behind. As she walked down a quiet lane, a rough-looking man stepped from the shadows, his face half hidden by a scarf. He grabbed her arm. "The Duke of Ashford needs to learn what loss feels like," he hissed. Alara's scream was cut short by a gloved hand. She struggled, terror flooding her veins. At that moment, hoofbeats thundered down the lane. Cedric, who had been riding to the village to deliver a book he had promised her, appeared. He dismounted in a flash, shouting, and the attacker fled into the trees. Cedric caught Alara as she sagged, her face white, her wrist bruised. He held her steady, murmuring reassurances, and then gently lifted her onto his horse to bring her home. When they arrived at Thornwood Hall, Alexander was waiting on the steps, his face ashen. News had somehow reached him. He took the steps two at a time and lifted Alara from the saddle himself, his arms trembling with an emotion she had never seen. He carried her inside, barking orders for a physician, and did not leave her side. That night, he sat in a chair by her bed, his head bowed, his hands gripping the armrests as though he were holding himself together by force. Alara, drowsy from a calming draught, looked at him through half-closed eyes. "Why do you care?" she whispered. "You never have before." The question was the final key. Alexander rose and knelt beside the bed, taking her hand with a gentleness that made her heart stop. "Because I have loved you from the beginning," he said, his voice breaking. "And because my love nearly killed you today." Then in raw, halting sentences, he told her everything. the letter from Lord Harrow before the wedding, the explicit threats against anyone he cherished, his determination to protect her by making the world believe she meant nothing to him. He had hired extra guards, monitored every suspicious shadow, but he had never imagined Harrow would act so directly. Every cold word, every turn back, every evening he had spent locked in his study, all of it had been a desperate attempt to shield her. And in the process, he had broken her heart. He told her how he had watched her slow withdrawal, how the sight of the trunk in her sitting room had shattered him, how he had realized too late that his protection had become her torment. Alara listened, tears streaming silently into her hair. The pain of the past months, the confusion, the loneliness, it all rearranged itself into a picture she could finally understand. But one thing still did not fit. "The letters in your library," she said, her voice barely audible. "The anonymous ones tied with blue ribbon. Why did you keep them?" Alexander looked at her, confusion flickering through his grief. "How do you know about those?" She swallowed. "Because I wrote them. 2 years ago, after your engagement ended, I saw you at the country fair in the rain helping a child. I never meant you to find out. I only wanted you to know you were not alone." He stared at her, the color draining from his face, and then with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he pressed her hand to his forehead. "Those letters kept me alive in a dark season. I read them every night for months. I never knew who sent them, but I loved her, whoever she was, for giving me hope." He lifted his eyes to hers. "It was you. All along it was you." The silence that followed was not empty but full, the way a cathedral is full of light. Alara felt the last shard of ice around her heart melt. "I loved you before we ever met," she said, "and I have loved you every day since, even when I thought you despised me." Alexander rose, gently cupped her face, and pressed his lips to her forehead with a reverence that spoke more than any kiss. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Forgive me for every moment of silence, every hour you spent alone. I thought I was saving you. Instead, I almost lost you." She lifted a trembling hand to touch his cheek, feeling the dampness there. "You are a foolish man, Alexander Blackwood, but you are my foolish man, and I will not leave you." He gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were made of something precious and breakable. And in that embrace, the months of distance and longing and secret pain began to dissolve. The next weeks were not an instant cure, but they were a beginning. Alexander finally allowed himself to be seen. He accompanied Alara to the village, sat beside her at dinner, and lingered in the drawing room long after the candles burned low. He told her about his fears, his guilt, and the constant vigilance that had exhausted him. With Lord Harrow now identified and the attack investigated, authorities moved swiftly, and the man was apprehended. The shadows that had haunted Thornwood Hall lifted slowly, like fog retreating before dawn. Alara, for her part, did not abandon the strength she had built. She continued her charity work, but now with Alexander by her side, his hand often finding hers as they walked the lanes. The servants began to smile more, and Lady Margaret wept happy tears the first time she saw her brother press a spontaneous kiss to his wife's temple. Cedric, with characteristic grace, accepted the new order without bitterness. At a garden party some months later, he remarked to Alexander, "She was always a rare soul. I am glad you finally noticed." Alexander clasped his cousin's shoulder, a silent acknowledgment of the debt he owed him. And the letters, those fragile pieces of a secret past, were moved from the library drawer to a special box in the Duchess's sitting room, a testament to a love that had survived silence and fear. One soft evening in late summer, Alexander and Alara stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The scent of roses drifted on the breeze. He slipped his arm around her waist, and she leaned into him, her heart full and quiet. "I used to stand here alone," she said, "and wonder if I would ever belong to this place or to you." He turned her gently to face him, his gray eyes holding hers. "You belong to me," he said, his voice low and sure, "not because of a contract or a name, but because you chose to love a man who gave you every reason not to." and I will spend the rest of my life earning the gift you have given me." She smiled, the kind of smile that comes not from perfect happiness but from a deep, hard-won peace. "Then let us live, Alexander, truly live." And they did, not in a fairy tale of perpetual bliss, but in the quiet, daily choosing of each other. The laughter returned to Thornwood Hall, not as an echo but as a living, breathing thing. The Duke who had been a statue became a man, and the Duchess who had learned to vanish found herself finally, fully seen. In the end, their love was not a sudden storm but a slow, steady light, a light that had been kindled in secret letters, tested by cold seasons, and at last allowed to burn bright and warm, a beacon for two hearts that had never truly given up on each other.